Hi, Pastor Sam here. Sorry about that glare on my glasses. The only way I can really deal with it is by turning on the overhead lights in my office, but frankly, the glow off my head is so bright, well, it becomes a bit distracting. So we'll have to live with it this way, and I'm sure I'll figure out an alternative, or more likely somebody will tell me how to do this better because, frankly, most people feel free to share that with me, and that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. I need coaching. And speaking of somebody who needed coaching, let's think a bit about Moses and Moses' call to the service of God. Moses, as a leader, was really perfectly credentialed to become the liberator of the Hebrew people. He was himself a Hebrew, and yet he grew up in the house of Pharaoh. His name itself is kind of a nickname. His original name was Ramses, and it gets shortened into Moses. You see how that works? And so he's raised in this household, and it's a place where he gets a very good education, especially in the magical arts. He is a scholar. He is a wisdom figure. And yet he also has this very strong impulse to make a change, to liberate the Hebrews. We remember the story perhaps of how he gets so full of himself to do this that he actually kills an Egyptian and buries the body in the sand. Hebrews witness this, the very people he's trying to liberate, and they accuse him of murder. They reject his leadership, and so Moses must flee into the wilderness. Yet even here his credentialing, his education continues. He meets Zipporah, his wife, who is a Midianite. He comes under the tutelage of his father-in-law Jethro, and he takes care of the sheep. He's a shepherd. In other words, he learns how to negotiate because, frankly, that's what marriage often is about, is negotiating with somebody. And he learns how to submit to the authority of somebody else, who is Jethro, his father-in-law, his teacher. And he learns how to lead. He learns how to lead by way of taking care of sheep. And so he's really perfectly prepared to return to Egypt, and yet God calls him. There's a definite sense of call. There's a conviction in his heart. There's a conviction in his mind. Yet we find Moses resisting that call. He still doesn't feel ready. In fact, we imagine that Moses never does feel ready for the important task that he takes up. More than once in the wilderness, he cries out to God because he feels like he's about to be overwhelmed by the task. That never goes away, that sense of being inadequate. And yet eventually, after hearing from God in the burning bush, he goes back into Egypt, and there he takes up the liberation role, the leadership role for which we remember him. So, what does the story teach us about God's call? The first is that if our hearts and minds are open to us through a variety of means, God will call us. God will give us a nudge. I remember being in seminary. Here are all the different stories about how these folks around me got to be there. There are different experiences of God's call, and it came through a very, very large number of human means, and yet at the end of their time in seminary, they were fully convicted that God wanted them to serve Christ's church, and through Christ's church to serve in the world. God's call comes in a number of ways, but there are some marker things along the way. The first is that God, after God calls us, God also credentials us. God makes sure that we have the tools we need, the backgrounds we require to be the sort of people God wants us to be as Christians, as faithful people, even as leaders, not just in the church, but in the neighborhood or in the workplace or wherever it is that we might find ourselves having the opportunity to serve. God credentials us. And yet that credentialing, and this is another point to be made, can be pretty hard. It doesn't feel like simply earning a professional degree. It feels a lot like being disciplined. learning the hard way sometimes of how to be the very best people we can be. We learn, especially in the credentialing, and this is an additional point, that in this credentialing, we learn to do things God's way. Moses tried to do things Moses' way and failed miserably. And so he learns to do things God's way. And when we're called, it takes time for us to learn what God's way is, what God's way of love and of mercy and of justice can be, what God's way of joy and patience and faithfulness can be. It takes time. And finally, even after we're fully credentialed and God says, now is the time to go, we never feel quite like we're up to the task. And that may feel like some sense of inadequacy, but there's another word for it, and that's humility. When we go where God sends us, when we feel invited to jump in where we feel like God needs us to be, if we go in with some sense that we're not quite ready, we are humble enough to look to God and ask God for help. And we're also humble enough, by the way, to ask for other people for help. God calls us continuously. I still feel, I'm kind of an old goat in ministry, but I still feel every day called by God. But I also recognize that God is constantly credentialing me. God is constantly preparing me. God is disciplining me. God is putting me in the position where I learn from God and do things as God would want me to do. And finally, I never feel prepared, but I always feel God is at hand. And as long as I look to God, well, that ministry that I do, whatever it looks like, whatever course it takes, wherever it takes me, will ultimately accrue to the will of God and redound to the glory of God. Thanks for listening and reflecting with me on this wonderful story of Moses.